Hello, Calaveras County. Welcome to another episode of Mondo Calaveras. I'm your host, Mike Taylor. Now, if there's one thing you have to do when you come to Calaveras County, it's plan. And one of my previous lives, I was involved in the title industry, and I got pretty involved with how properties change hands and that. And a lot of people who come up here to have that property change hands want to develop it. And the first person you've got to meet is my guest this time around, and that's Peter Maurer, Calaveras County's planning director. Nice to have you, Peter.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
You bet. Now, first for viewers, let's talk a little bit about exactly what the planning department does, because I know that's a little bit different than what the planning commission does.
Well, that's right. The planning department is the county staff, and we deal with sort of an oxymoron, current planning and long-range planning. Mm-hmm. Planning is sort of a general catch-all, I suppose, for sort of the bureaucracy of land use. Mm-hmm. We look at subdivision maps, we look at use permits for different commercial types of businesses, but also just conformance with the zoning. So if you've got a piece of property that's zoned residential, you want to build a house on it, yeah, that's good. What are the setbacks? What are the height requirements? Are there any special standards that need to be met? So we'll review all the building permits and then say, yes, it's conforms with the zone, pass it on to the building department, and they'll go ahead and do the plan check so someone can build a house. Okay. So that, current planning activities are, are you consistent with the zoning? What uses can I do in what zones? I want to start a business up. Where can I go? So we'll check the zoning for different sites. Okay. Work a lot with the real estate industry as well as the commercial businesses in the county. We've got a policy at the county of trying to promote economic development, and so we're here to try to assist people in doing that. But we've got a lot of rules and regulations that are in place. Some of those are pretty outdated. We've got a general plan that's 22 years old. We've got a zoning ordinance that's even a lot older than that. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that we could do to improve the climate of business in the county. At the same time, a lot of conflicting mandates. We've got to protect the environment. We've got a lot of state regulations. We've got people that live in homes and they want to protect their property values. So zoning became effective because of the real estate industry wanting to protect the value of their home, so you don't put an industrial plant right next to your multi-million-dollar home. Sure. But that, there's a lot of conflict involved, and part of us is, our job is to be the peacemakers, try to find that compromise. So often we're working with community members to say, okay, you want to do this. How do we go about doing that? How do we make sure that your project doesn't adversely impact your next door neighbors? And that's sort of, in general what we do. Now, a lot of times we have to say no. We usually try to find a way to say yes. Okay, you want to do this. It's not straightforward, but if you go around this way, you get this permit, then you can get to where you want to be. Or maybe if you modify that slightly, and that'll comply with the rules. Sometimes, though, we have to say, no, I'm sorry, you cannot put your rendering plant in the residential neighborhood. But for the most part, our job is to try to find a way to allow someone to do what they want to do with their property within the confines of local, state, and federal regulations. Sure. And there are a lot of them.
I was going to say, probably just from the state, there are way too many volumes.
Right.
And then you add the few that the county has, and so you've got an awful lot of rules and regulations to follow.
And sometimes I think of myself more as a fireman than a planner. We're putting out fires here and there. Someone, there's an issue that comes up, and we've got to react to that. It's a concern by a board member, or the public comes to us and say, we've got this issue next door. You need to stop it. So we need to find out, well, can they do what they do? If so, what permits do they need, if any?
Sure.
And I guess the other joke we have is we're not really a planning department, we're a reacting department. But
that's an interesting.
I like to think that we do look beyond just the day-to-day needs.
Sure.
Because there is a lot of that, and we've got a public counter that's open. People are constantly coming to us asking questions, how to respond to that. But we also try to look, to the future. What is it we'd like our community to be?
Sure.
And how can we get there? And so that's the purpose, really, of the general plan, is looking at a broader scale, broader scope of the full county. And we want economic development. We need to have, or required to have, a certain amount of environmental protection. We're trying to promote our tourist industry, so people come here because it's a beautiful county to live in.
Place.
There's nice places to visit. We've got wineries and art galleries and other businesses that we want to promote. We coordinate with the state and federal government as far as access to state and federal land. That's a selling point. So people that come up to visit Calaveras Big Trees, or go camping in the Sierra Nevada, how can we help accommodate that? Provide lodging, provide campgrounds, those kinds of things as well. But we also have a ton of state mandates. Example is we've got to update our housing element. We have to provide a certain amount of housing, and we have to provide housing to meet all the income levels of the county, at least provide the opportunity so that people can build housing for that. Every year the state gets more and more strict with regards to housing element requirements. I've been working with the committee of other planning directors around the state, working on new legislation that's being proposed in Sacramento, looking at say, well, wait a second, this is not workable. We need to, try to ratchet it back a little bit.
Thank goodness the experts are looking at it before the legislators pass it,
well,
right?
Doesn't always work that way.
I know.
We try our best. And, unfortunately, the bulk of the population live in urban areas, and so you have places like the Bay Area and Los Angeles. They've got the most representation in Sacramento.
They do, sadly.
And so we try to get our voice in, saying, what might work in Marin County or Orange County doesn't necessarily work in Calaveras or Modoc or some of the more rural areas. And so, not one size fits all.
Fits all, definitely.
So we're in the beginning stages of a housing element update. We're required to do it every 5 years.
Is that, and talking about that is something that in this county, and maybe a little bit more since the Butte fire, not that we lost a lot of rentals in the Butte fire, but a lot of people had to suddenly go rent during the Butte fire. And it seems like those kinds of multifamily housing developments haven't necessarily come to the county. Is that something that this housing element looks at?
Well, it's a range of affordability that we're looking at. And typically multifamily housing is the way you meet the lower or moderate income housing. But it doesn't have to be. And so I think what we're looking at is trying to find a way to encourage developers to provide that range of housing. Look at smaller scale, not necessarily the tiny homes, but a 1,500, 1,800 square foot home, which would be a great starter home for a young family or an elderly person. I think the biggest problem we really have is housing for the elderly. Our population of over 65 is twice the average of the state. Wow. So we have a lot of retirees. We also have a lot of people that have, grown up, raised their families. Maybe they had 5 or 10 acres, and now they're aging, and they don't want to care for that property, but they want to stay in their community. Where do you find? How do you downscale? How do you find a house that's appropriate for an aging couple? And I'm getting there pretty soon. I don't want to care for 10 acres or something like that. Physically, you're not able to do that.
You're just
not. But you're involved in your community. You have friends, you have family nearby. You want to stay there. So that's something that we're trying to look at. Accessory dwelling units or granny flats, or one way to meet that requirement as well. But we also, we're looking at apartments. We're looking at, where can we appropriately put the kind of density necessary to make it economically feasible for a developer to construct. They need to make a profit in order to build something. And so you can mandate all you want, but if it doesn't pencil out, no one's going to build anything.
If it doesn't pencil out,
and that's the challenge we're looking at right now, is that the cost of construction is very high, particularly in a county where you got to pay more for transport, for materials. Labor costs might be higher just because of the lack of certain skills in the community. And so, if you just pencil out, it costs more to build the house than you can sell it for. And so no one's going to build it. And that's what we're facing right now in our community. Very little construction is happening because the cost of construction just doesn't pay for the cost. The demand's not there.
Pencil out.
Other than the real high end of housing. There's always someone
Yeah.
that's got enough money to build, their mansion,
Sure.
their dream home, which is great. People want that too. I
Yeah.
like my home, and
Every time I fly over Calaveras County, I'm shocked at the number of homes that have popped up on hilltops.
Yeah.
And those aren't small dwellings going up on those
typically.
hilltops.
So, we're looking at trying to provide that range of housing. We're also looking at, how can we encourage other economic development, jobs, retail sales. We're in a unique position here where we're surrounded by other communities that have all of the retail establishments that people here want and need. So we're a captive audience. We're not going to get a Walmart. We're not going to get a Trader Joe's or something like that because they're already
They're
nearby.
too close. Yeah.
And so we need to look at how do we grow our own industry here. We have a store, maybe they hire 6 people. Well, how can they grow to hire 12 people? And that's going to be the type of economic growth that we're likely to see in our county here, is where, people are deciding, I'm going to stay in the county to shop. I'll spend my money here, so the tax dollar stays here. The spillover effect of the economic benefit of, I'm going to buy a good, at a store here in San Andreas, they're going to buy their supplies maybe from somewhere else in the county. So that multiplier effect is really important in a community.
You mentioned that we're not seeing much residential development right now. Are the water starting to churn a little bit with some commercial development? Where some of these small shops and that kind of thing might show up?
Not a lot.
Okay.
There is some, and we've seen a little bit of interest in different businesses moving in. Typically, at least the retail follows the housing.
Yeah, so you kind of need the residents before you need
But at the same
services.
time, if the housing isn't actually supporting your local businesses, and they're doing all their shopping down the hill or over in Sonora or Jackson, then it doesn't necessarily pay for itself. That you're basically paying the costs of the services that the population demands without necessarily getting the benefits of their spending and their job creation in the county. So it's a delicate balance. It's hard to really tell. We probably would benefit from doing some more in-depth economic analysis of how that all pencils out. But it's there are all obviously jobs to be created, construction jobs and things like that. So it's not, I don't want to say it's a bad thing. Developing housing, but we're required to provide the housing, but we also need to balance the costs and resources. So we're looking at attracting industries in the county that would help balance that.
And then the other, and you can tell me what percentage of your time is taken up by it, but is the Planning Commission, because you're kind of the executive director of planning, and so you're the guy sitting there with the planning commissioners, who is the
So the Planning Commission
body.
are 5 members, appointed body, approved by the board. Each board member appoints an individual
From
within
his
the
or her
district, and then the full board approves those appointees. They are essentially a decision-making body or an advisory body to the board. So use permit or a variance, a tentative map will go to the Planning Commission, and they will take our recommendation. We think this should be approved with these conditions, or this should be denied because it's not consistent with our rules and policies. And they'll say yay or nay to that. In some cases, it must go to the board. So if it's a zone change, if it's what they call a legislative act, then that requires board action. But in many cases, the Planning Commission action is final, unless it's appealed, and then the board is sort of the final appeal authority. And in some cases, I actually have that authority on some minor types of permits.
Is that like the lot line variances and stuff like that?
Things like that, yeah. I mean, some of those are more or less ministerial. There's, but minor use, administrative use permits, variances. There's a few other things that I have the approving authority on, but often. For example, while we were regulating cannabis, I had the approving authority on the registrations, and we had a lot of appeals of those. So the Planning Commission time for the past year and a half was fully taken up with cannabis appeals.
kind of thanks for bringing that up. We know that cannabis has been banned now. Is the board looking at it again? Or I can't remember what the latest direction to you folks in the planning department was,
Well, the board adopted the ban last January. It became effective in March. There was a 90-day window when those people who had registered under the urgency program had to wind down their operations. That became effective in June. So the program is over. There is no change at the board level at this point that would suggest that we're going to do anything else. So the ban is in place. That is the law of the land. And so we just held our very last appeal hearing on Tuesday, because that was yesterday. So as far as I'm concerned, we're done with trying to regulating cannabis, other than the existing, the previous ordinance on medical dispensaries, retail location. So there are 3 of those in the counties, and those go through an annual permit review. But as far as cultivation is concerned, the ban is the law of the land today.
So your staff now has time to do things, it sounds like.
Well, it's really been
because it felt like you guys were just kind of overwhelmed with the cannabis applications and getting through everything. So it was almost a year and a half, 2 years of you guys trying to climb over that hill of paperwork that all had to do with cannabis. Were you able to keep up with the other stuff? And
to some degree, yes. Clearly cany was all-consuming for my department. We hired a lot of extra staff to try to handle the workload. It wasn't enough. Any other department that was affected by it, whether it was building, code compliance, public works, environmental management, they all were affected by the urgency ordinance and the numbers of applications that we had received. It's been sort of like catching our breath for the past couple of months, realizing, wow. And the timing is really good for us right now, because the draft EIR comment period was earlier this summer. It ended a few weeks ago, so now we're beginning to prepare the response to comments and get the final EIR done so we can actually get to adoption hearings.
So that's a nice segue. Where do we kind of go with that now, with this 22-year-old general plan that I've heard some developers talk is almost indefensible if they were to come in and question, and that's probably developer speak.
Well, I don't know that it's actually developer speak. I think that there is a group of individuals in the county that would like to see us change the general plan. It is 22 years old. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. So there was analysis done by a consulting firm that suggested that it be updated. That they found there's some items that predated my time. The decision was made to do that. So when I inherited the department and the project, it's like, okay, we're moving forward. That decision. I think that the plan could have been amended and revised to update it.
Rather than rebuilding the whole document.
And I like to think of a general plan as a business plan. Someone doesn't open a business, say, I got my plan, I'm going to put it on the shelf, and I'll look at it again in 20 years and change it if it's not working.
That's right.
It should be reviewed on a yearly or biannual basis and say, what are we doing right? Have there been changes in circumstances? I mean, no one in the early 2000s would have expected that the economic crash would have occurred in 2008, 2009, that would have essentially turned the county into a rapidly developing county to one that was losing population growth. So those kinds of changes say, well, wait a second, we need to go back and revisit, is the plan working for us? Or is there something, are there policies in the plan that are stymieing the type of development we'd like to see? Or is it directing it to some place that doesn't have the infrastructure that we need? And so those are the kind of things that should be revisited on a regular basis and say, well, this isn't, in general, the plan is working for us. We're going in the direction we want to go, but we need to tweak this here. We need to adjust here. We need to say, okay, we're looking at housing, and if we plan for X number of residential units and suddenly we see an increase in development, say, okay, well, we're running out of space for residential development. We need to identify new areas that can support that. Or, the housing mandates from the state come down and say, you need more multifamily housing. So we need to look at our plan and say, well, where can we put multifamily housing? Where do we have sewer infrastructure and public water and access to schools and shopping where we could put higher density housing
Sure.
to support that level.
Well, and that's kind of the toughest thing for a lot of these smaller communities in Calaveras County that do have sewer systems, is those are getting to the point where they're maxed out. And so to make that next developmental jump, it's going to get costly.
Right.
You're going to have to expand, and that's why I think we're seeing the rate increases and whatnot, because those boards are starting to say, hey, if we don't start, saving up, we're not going to have the matching funds to expand our facility like we're going to need.
Well, there's a lot of coordination between the county and there's a number of different, we got fire districts, water districts, sewer districts, all of which provide a service that are necessary to make a community work. In cities, it's typically all under one umbrella of the city government. But with counties, particularly a dispersed rural county like us, you've got lots of separate special districts.
Sure.
And each one has its own board and its own decision-making process. But when we, have a development proposal, we need to coordinate with them and say, well, can you serve this project? And if not, what do you need to do to improve the service? Do you just need to extend a water line or a sewer line, or do you need to expand your plant? And so we have to look at that when we're identifying areas of future growth, and how can that be supported.
So the direction for the general plan, does it come from your staff or from the community, or I'm guessing it's kind of from a blended version of everybody?
It's a little bit of everything. Obviously the board sets the policy, and so they make the decision. We need to update it, and are we going to be sort of pro-growth, or are we going to try to slow down growth? Those are major policy issues. But a lot of public input. We've had a number of community meetings. There was a lot of, particularly in District 2, community planning efforts to look at how does Mountain Ranch grow, how does Railroad Flat grow. Valley Springs and Copperopolis also had a lot of work done in those ways. We've tried to incorporate that planning effort without actually having separate community plans. But I looked at all of that information that was gathered during that time, and it dates back to the mid-2000s. So there's 10 years more of work that doesn't need to be wasted. It's valuable information, and we try to incorporate those into general policies that apply countywide, as well as specific policies for each community. And more work needs to be done on that. We've got the whole Highway 4 corridor, where there are separate community plans today that haven't been updated in 20 or 30 years as well. Valley Springs, Copperopolis are also communities that we need to look more closely at how are they developing. But the focus right now is get the general plan done. Get that out from under, so we can say we have an updated general plan. The question of the adequacy of that plan can be sort of put to bed. So then we can move forward with implementation measures and updating looking more specifically at individual communities and how do we enhance those communities.
It sounds like you see the general plan, and I would agree with you, as a living document. I mean, it's got to be something that can grow and shift and change almost at the community's will when that change needs to be happened.
Absolutely. Right? I mean, it needs to be a guiding document. Otherwise, it's just a piece of paper. You need to say, okay, what do we want to do? How do we get there? There's also a number of state mandates that say you must do all these things, and some of it's pretty ridiculous, and some of it makes a lot of sense. But over the years, it's evolved a lot. So there's a lot of stuff in there that you could just sort of view it as fluff, but other things, this makes sense. You have to look at fire safety planning. You have to look at there's a new requirement for what's called environmental justice. And so if you have a community that has, high poverty, and they happen to be right next to the railroad tracks, to the industrial plants, well, that's not really a fair way, particularly if you've got, ethnic groups that are focused in those areas. So that's the direction of the state legislation that created this requirement. So we're looking at it and say, well, we don't have some of those same. I mean, we have areas of poverty, but they're not next to. Most of them are up in the more remote parts of the county. So what are those individuals in our community facing? What kind of challenges? And access to health care is a big issue in this county.
It is.
You cannot give birth in a hospital. You don't have any
Not right
maternity.
now.
And then if you live in a remote part of the county, you have to drive an hour to see a doctor. And if you can find a doctor that will actually take new patients.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of things that we're sort of looking at now to sort of address that issue, which is a different situation than some of the more urban-centric requirements that the state mandates on us. So you have to adjust to that.
So we're down to about our last 3 or 4 minutes. What is the sort of, here's what's next and here's how we get it done for the general plan?
So the next step in the process is the final EIR. So we have a number of comments. I've got a stack of comment letters about that thick. Then we're pouring through those and looking at those. We need to respond in writing to each one of those comments.
Okay, and that's actually like mailed to the person who's
no, it'll be a document.
It goes into one document.
It becomes what's called the final EIR. It includes a response to comment, all the comment letters, the response to comments, changes to the EIR that need to be done. Revisions to mitigation measures or new mitigation measures that have been recommended through the process, and changes to the draft plan. Then we begin hearings with the Planning Commission. So they'll review all of the proposed changes, the adequacy of the EIR, and then finally make a recommendation to the board. I'm hoping that we can get through that at the end of later this year.
Really?
It really depends on how long it takes, and we're just in the very early stages of reviewing those comments. And some of them are very technical and they're going to be lengthy a process to review and comment on them.
What's the most, and you've been here in Calaveras County about 4.5 years, what's the most outlandish thing you've seen come as a proposal for something to be built in Calaveras County? Whether you said yay or nay.
I don't know if there's anything really outlandish.
That crazy.
Some of the more controversial stuff was the asphalt plant down in Valley Springs. Some of the issues that are challenging for us is, the rebuilding after the Butte fire, obviously.
How are we doing after that, incidentally? Are we...
We're very slowly recovering. It's going to be a long process. We lost a lot of homes. A lot of people chose not to rebuild and moved away. That was a loss on our population and a downturn in economic development for the county. People that were building homes are not doing that. On the other hand, we have a lot of new building permits of people that are building homes.
Well, good.
So that's created jobs for at least the construction industry.
Sure.
I would say that we're slowly recovering from that. It's going to be a long process. Folks that lived up in the woods, beautiful forest environment, now looking at a moonscape, and so it's not as attractive for real estate investment and those kinds of things. So
like everything else after that fire, it's going to take time. Well, I want to thank you, Peter Maurer, our Calaveras County Planning Director, for being here. And the reason I'm kind of stopping like this is because I'm going to editorialize a little bit. And that's, ladies and gentlemen, when you're going to deal with Calaveras County government, have a little patience. Don't show up at the government center angry, and I'm sure Peter can vouch for this. There's nothing worse than dealing with someone who's screaming at you from the counter when you can be dealing with someone who is just kind of asking a question and seeking an answer. So be friendly to the county staff, and Peter Maurer, thank you for being here. Folks, I'm Mike Taylor. Join me next time for Mondo Calaveras. Until then, enjoy.